"We already moved your things downstairs," my son said before I had even taken off my black funeral coat. The front door was still open behind me, letting in the cold March air along with the faint scent of cemetery flowers clinging to my clothes. For a moment, I thought I had heard Daniel wrong. My mind was still wrapped in the image of Richard's casket disappearing beneath white lilies and damp earth just an hour earlier. I stood frozen in the foyer of the house I had lived in for 42 years, staring at my son as though he were a stranger who had wandered into someone else's life. Vanessa stood a few feet behind him, one hand resting lightly on the staircase railing. She wore cream-colored cashmere and a careful expression that looked almost rehearsed. Not grief, not sympathy, just discomfort, as if this conversation was inconvenient timing. "Downstairs," I repeated quietly. Daniel rubbed the back of his neck without meeting my eyes. "We thought it would be easier this way, Mom. You know, less stairs. Safer. Safer." The word echoed strangely in my head. Richard and I had climbed those stairs together for decades. We climbed them when we carried newborn Daniel home from the hospital. We climbed them on Christmas mornings and after arguments and after long vacations. Richard climbed them slowly during the final months, one careful step at a time while refusing to let me see how much pain he was in. And now my son was standing there talking about safety as though I were a fragile guest in my own home. I looked past him toward the hallway leading to the master bedroom. The bedroom door stood open. From where I was standing, I could already see the difference. The quilt Richard's mother had sewn for us was gone from the bed. The framed wedding photograph that always sat on my dresser had disappeared. My chest tightened so suddenly I had to steady myself against the wall. "Where are my things?" I asked. Vanessa finally spoke, her voice smooth and measured. "We packed everything carefully. We didn't want you stressing about it after today." Stressing about it after today. As though returning from my husband's funeral to find my life packed into cardboard boxes was some thoughtful act of kindness. I walked slowly down the hallway. Neither of them followed me. The silence behind me felt heavier than footsteps would have. Inside the bedroom, the air smelled different. Not like Richard's cedar aftershave or the lavender sachets I kept in the drawers. It smelled faintly of fresh linen spray. The comforter on the bed had been replaced with a pale cream one I had never seen before. Decorative pillows sat neatly against the headboard like something from a furniture showroom. My side of the closet was completely empty. For several long seconds, I simply stared at the wooden hangers lined up in perfect order. Empty. Every trace of me erased before the flowers on Richard's grave had even begun to wilt. Near the doorway sat 3 large cardboard boxes sealed with packing tape. One of them had black marker across the side in Vanessa's handwriting. "Downstairs bedroom." I knelt slowly beside the nearest box and pulled back one flap. Inside was my life. Sweaters Richard bought me for anniversaries. My jewelry case. A framed photograph of Daniel at age 8 holding the fishing rod his father gave him. On top of everything lay the black dress I had worn to the funeral only hours earlier. Folded neatly. Put away already. I sat back on my heels and stared at it while something cold and quiet settled deep inside my chest. Not anger. Not yet. Something worse. The terrible realization that while I had been burying my husband, my son and his wife had already started burying me too. I barely slept that night. The downstairs guest room felt unfamiliar in a way I could not explain, even though I had walked past it thousands of times over the years. The mattress was too soft. The curtains smelled faintly like detergent instead of the lavender fabric spray I used upstairs. Every sound in the house seemed sharper now. The creak of floorboards above me. The low hum of the dishwasher. Vanessa's muffled laughter drifting through the ceiling sometime after midnight. I lay awake staring at the shadows moving across the walls, still wearing one of Richard's old cardigans wrapped tightly around my shoulders. At around 6 in the morning I finally gave up on sleep and walked quietly into the kitchen. For 42 years mornings had belonged to Richard and me. He always woke first. He would grind coffee beans while humming old Frank Sinatra songs badly off-key. Then he would stand by the window over the sink watching the birds gather near the maple tree in the backyard. Even after his retirement, he never broke the habit. But the kitchen I stepped into no longer felt like ours. Vanessa had already changed things. The ceramic cookie jar my sister gave us 20 years ago was gone from the counter. The framed photograph of Richard holding Daniel at Yankee Stadium had disappeared from beside the refrigerator. Even the blue hand towels I bought last Thanksgiving had been replaced with cream-colored ones that matched the new bedding upstairs. I stood there for several seconds holding onto the edge of the counter, while a strange heaviness settled inside my chest. It was happening so fast. Too fast for grief. Too fast for mourning. It felt less like my husband had died and more like my entire existence was being quietly edited out of the house room by room. Footsteps sounded behind me. Vanessa entered wearing white athletic clothes and carrying a stainless steel water bottle. She stopped briefly when she saw me standing there. "Oh," she said softly. "You are up early." I nodded once. Could not sleep. She opened the refrigerator and pulled out almond milk. "I was thinking we might repaint downstairs eventually," she said casually while pouring herself coffee. "Maybe something brighter. It feels a little dark down there." Down there. Like I had already been relocated permanently. I looked at her carefully. Her blonde hair was perfectly smooth. Her makeup flawless. Not a trace of swollen eyes or sleepless grief. Richard had been buried less than 12 hours earlier. "Your father-in-law loved this kitchen exactly the way it is," I said quietly. Vanessa gave a small smile without looking at me. "Well, people have to move forward eventually." A few minutes later Daniel came downstairs wearing gym clothes. He kissed Vanessa on the cheek before finally glancing toward me. "Morning, Mom." Morning. As though nothing had happened. As though my life had not been packed into boxes while I stood beside my husband's grave. I watched my son pour himself coffee from Richard's favorite mug, the navy blue one with the chipped handle he refused to throw away. Daniel did not even seem to notice. That hurt more than anything. Not cruelty. Not anger. Just how quickly they had become comfortable replacing him. Replacing us. The following afternoon, I noticed the first real sign that none of this had been temporary. Vanessa had hired movers. I watched through the dining room window as two men carried large rolls of fabric and paint samples into the house while a white SUV with the logo of an interior design company sat parked in the driveway. For several seconds I honestly wondered if they had come to the wrong address. Then Vanessa walked in behind them smiling politely, carrying iced coffees in a cardboard tray as though she had been planning this for weeks. "We are just exploring options," she said when she noticed me standing near the hallway. "Nothing official yet." Exploring options. Richard had not even been gone 3 full days. One of the movers brushed past me carrying a large mirror from upstairs. I recognized it immediately. Richard and I bought that mirror during our 10th anniversary trip to Vermont. We had driven nearly 400 miles through heavy rain because Richard insisted antique shops looked more charming in bad weather. He spent an hour bargaining with the shop owner over that mirror, while I laughed at him from across the room. Now strangers carried it through my house wrapped in gray moving blankets while my daughter-in-law discussed paint palettes. I stood there quietly, holding my coffee mug with both hands because I suddenly did not trust myself not to drop it. "Where are they taking that?" I asked softly. Vanessa glanced toward the mirror. "Oh, upstairs. I thought it would open up the master bedroom more." "The master bedroom? Not your bedroom. Not Richard's room. Already renamed. Already reassigned." Daniel came home shortly before dinner carrying takeout containers from an Italian restaurant nearby. He looked exhausted but not from grief. From avoidance. He barely looked at me as he set food onto the kitchen counter. "Thought nobody would feel like cooking tonight," he said. Nobody. Another strange little word. As though we were all simply adjusting to a scheduling inconvenience instead of surviving a death. During dinner, Vanessa spread several renovation brochures across the table beside her plate. Bright modern kitchens. Open-concept living rooms. Minimalist bedrooms with white walls and oversized windows. "I really think lighter floors would completely transform this place," she said casually while twirling pasta around her fork. Daniel nodded absently. "Dad always liked darker wood," I said before I could stop myself. Vanessa gave a tight smile. "Well, trends change." Silence settled over the table after that. Heavy. Uncomfortable. Daniel focused on his food. Vanessa sipped wine slowly while scrolling through photos on her phone. I realized then that neither of them had mentioned Richard once during the entire meal. Not one memory. Not one story. Not even his name. Later that evening, I walked quietly upstairs while they watched television in the living room. The bedroom door was slightly open. Inside, fabric samples covered the bed. Cream. Beige. Soft gray. My wedding portrait sat face down on the floor beside the dresser like an object waiting to be discarded. I bent slowly to pick it up, running my fingers over the glass frame while tears finally burned behind my eyes for the first time since the funeral. Not because Richard was gone, but because I was beginning to understand that my son had already started building a future where neither his father nor his mother belonged anymore. 2 days later, rain covered the neighborhood in a cold gray mist that blurred the windows and turned the backyard into dark patches of wet earth and fallen leaves. Richard loved weather like that. He used to say rainy afternoons made the house feel alive, as though the walls themselves were protecting us from the world outside. I sat alone in the downstairs guest room holding one of his old flannel shirts across my lap, while the memory of his voice drifted through my mind so clearly it almost hurt to breathe. There had been signs before he died. Small moments I had ignored because I never imagined my own son would one day make me feel unwelcome in the home Richard spent his entire life building for us. About 6 months earlier, Richard and I had been sitting on the back porch watching the first snow of December settle across the yard. He had looked unusually serious that night, turning his wedding ring slowly around his finger the way he always did when something weighed heavily on his mind. "Promise me something," he had said quietly. I remember laughing softly because he sounded so formal. "That depends," I told him. "No," he replied with a tired smile. "I mean it, Evelyn. Promise me you will pay attention if things ever start feeling wrong around here." At the time I thought he was talking about his health. His heart problems had become worse that year, though he tried hard to hide how frightened he truly was. I reached for his hand and told him not to talk like that. But Richard kept looking out at the snow-covered yard with a distant expression I did not fully understand then. "People change after funerals," he said finally. "Grief does strange things to families." I remember feeling annoyed with him for sounding so gloomy. I told him Daniel would never treat me badly. Richard nodded slowly, but he never answered. Now, sitting downstairs while strangers measured windows upstairs, I realized he had known something long before I did. That evening, I walked quietly into Richard's old study for the first time since the funeral. Vanessa had not touched that room yet. The air still smelled faintly of leather books and cedarwood aftershave. His reading glasses rested beside an unfinished crossword puzzle on the desk exactly where he left them. I stood there running my fingertips lightly across the worn wood surface while memories rose around me like ghosts. Richard teaching Daniel algebra at that same desk. Richard balancing our checkbook every Sunday night. Richard falling asleep in his chair while baseball games played softly in the background. Then my eyes landed on a sealed white envelope tucked beneath the lamp. My name was written across the front in Richard's careful handwriting. My chest tightened instantly. With trembling fingers I opened it slowly. Inside was only a short handwritten note. "If you are reading this, it means I was right to worry. Trust Thomas. Read everything carefully before making any decisions. And remember this house was built for you long before anyone else claimed it." I read those words 3 times while rain tapped softly against the study windows. Upstairs, I could hear Vanessa laughing faintly while discussing paint colors on the phone. But downstairs, standing alone in Richard's study holding the final note my husband ever wrote to me, something inside me began to change. The grief was still there. Heavy. Sharp. But underneath it now was something colder. Awareness. The next morning, I called Thomas Bennett from Richard's study before Daniel and Vanessa woke up. My hand trembled slightly as I dialed the number written on the back of Richard's note. Thomas answered on the second ring, his voice low and steady. "Mrs. Harper," he said immediately, and something about hearing those words nearly broke me. Not Evelyn. Not Mom. Not the careful tone people use with widows they think are fragile. Mrs. Harper. The same respectful way he had greeted me for more than 20 years. "Richard told me you might call." I closed my eyes briefly. "He left me a note." Silence lingered softly on the line for a moment. Then Thomas spoke carefully. "Can you meet me today?" By 10 o'clock, I was sitting across from him inside his downtown office while cold rain streaked the windows overlooking Main Street. The office smelled faintly of coffee and old paper. Everything looked exactly the same as it had for years. dark wooden shelves, green banker's lamps, framed photographs of Thomas with judges and city officials. The familiarity of it all made my chest ache unexpectedly. Thomas removed his glasses slowly and studied me with visible concern. Richard was worried, he said quietly. I looked down at my hands folded tightly in my lap. Worried about what? Thomas hesitated before answering. About how quickly things might change after his death. A bitter sadness settled inside me. Richard had known. Somehow he had seen this coming while I kept insisting our son would never hurt me. Thomas opened a thick folder resting on his desk. Before we discuss anything else, he said gently, I need to ask you a direct question. Has Daniel or his wife pressured you to leave the home? I thought about the boxes, the empty closet, the renovations already being planned upstairs. Not directly, I answered carefully, but they moved me downstairs the day of the funeral. Thomas went very still. His expression hardened in a way I had never seen before. I see. He reached into the folder and removed several documents clipped neatly together. Richard amended the family trust 7 months ago. My heartbeat quickened instantly. Thomas slid the papers toward me slowly. The house legally remains yours for the rest of your life. Daniel does not inherit ownership unless certain conditions are met. I stared at him in stunned silence. What conditions? Thomas folded his hands together. Richard created what is called a behavioral protection clause. If Daniel or anyone acting on his behalf attempts to pressure, manipulate, isolate, or remove you from the home, he forfeits his inheritance rights immediately. The room became very quiet after that. Outside, rain tapped softly against the windows while traffic moved through the wet streets below. I could barely process what I was hearing. Richard had protected me. Not emotionally. Legally. Thoroughly. Thomas looked at me carefully before speaking again. Mrs. Harper, your husband loved you very much. He suspected there could be problems after his passing. He wanted to make certain you would never be powerless in your own home. I swallowed hard, staring at the trust documents spread across the desk between us. Upstairs in my house, Vanessa was probably still choosing paint samples for a bedroom she did not legally own. And for the first time since Richard's funeral, I finally understood something clearly. They thought I was alone now. They were wrong. When I returned home that afternoon, the house was louder than usual. Music drifted faintly from upstairs along with the sound of drawers opening and closing. For a moment I stood quietly in the foyer, holding my purse against my coat while listening to strangers move through rooms Richard and I once treated with care. It no longer sounded like a family home. It sounded like preparation. Vanessa appeared at the top of the staircase a few seconds later holding fabric swatches against the hallway wall. Oh good, she said brightly when she saw me. You are back. The designer thinks warmer tones will modernize everything upstairs. Stairs. Again. As though the second floor already belonged to her. I removed my gloves slowly, careful not to let anything show on my face. I see, I said quietly. Vanessa descended the stairs with smooth confidence, her heels clicking softly against the hardwood floors Richard spent 3 weekends refinishing by hand 15 years earlier. Daniel and I were also thinking maybe we could open up the bedroom space eventually, she continued casually. The layout feels a little outdated. I looked at her calmly. That bedroom was built exactly the way Richard wanted it. She smiled politely, but there was impatience behind it now. Well, people have different tastes. Different tastes. Such harmless words on the surface. Yet everything about this house had suddenly become subject to revision now that my husband was gone. Daniel arrived home shortly afterward carrying folders from work beneath one arm. He barely noticed the movers leaving through the front door. Hey Mom, he said distractedly before loosening his tie. Vanessa immediately crossed the room toward him holding paint samples against his chest. Tell her which one you liked better. Daniel glanced at them briefly. The lighter one probably. Then he disappeared into the kitchen without another thought. I watched him quietly from across the room. There was no hesitation anymore. No guilt. Just comfort. Comfort inside a future they had already started building for themselves. That evening while Vanessa showered upstairs, Daniel sat beside me in the living room pretending to scroll through emails on his phone. The television played softly in the background, though neither of us was watching it. Finally, he cleared his throat. "Mom," he said carefully, "Vanessa and I have been discussing some long-term plans." There it was. I folded my hands calmly in my lap. "What kind of plans?" He avoided my eyes immediately. "Well, eventually we may need more space if we decide to start a family." I nodded slowly but said nothing. Daniel shifted uncomfortably. "The downstairs setup could actually work really well for you permanently." Permanently. Such a simple word. One quiet sentence, and suddenly I understood everything completely. This had never been about helping me after the funeral. They had already decided where I belonged in the house before Richard was even buried. I looked at my son carefully then. The same little boy who used to crawl into our bed during thunderstorms because he thought his father could protect him from anything. Richard would have been devastated to see the man sitting in front of me now. But instead of anger, I felt something else settle inside me. Calm. Because for the first time I knew something Daniel did not. This house was not slipping away from me. It was slipping away from him. Over the next week I stopped arguing with them entirely. That seemed to make Vanessa more comfortable than anything else. She moved through the house with growing confidence now, speaking openly about renovations while standing in rooms that still carried Richard's fingerprints on the walls. One afternoon, I walked into the kitchen and found stacks of flooring samples spread across the table beside my husband's old coffee mug. Vanessa was comparing shades of oak while speaking to someone on speakerphone. "The upstairs will feel completely different once we knock out that wall," she said cheerfully. "Stairs. Always upstairs." As though I no longer existed beyond the guest room downstairs beside the laundry area. She barely paused when she noticed me enter. "Good morning," she said casually before turning back to her conversation. "We also want to brighten the primary bedroom." The primary bedroom. Another new name. Another small erasure. I poured myself coffee slowly while listening to her redesign the life Richard and I built together one room at a time. Daniel had become quieter lately, but not kinder. He spent most evenings reviewing financial documents at the dining room table while Vanessa scrolled through furniture websites beside him. Once, as I passed behind them carrying folded towels, I caught a glimpse of an email subject line on his laptop screen. Projected property value after renovation. My chest tightened briefly, though I kept walking without reacting. They were not grieving anymore. They were planning. A few days later, I came home from grocery shopping and noticed Richard's gardening bench missing from the backyard. It had sat beneath the maple tree for nearly 20 years. Richard built it himself one summer after retirement, sanding every corner carefully because he said cheap benches always splintered eventually. I found it later pushed against the garage wall beside old paint cans and broken storage bins. A layer of dust already covered the seat. That evening during dinner I finally asked about it. Vanessa barely looked up from her plate. The yard crew thought it looked cluttered. Cluttered. I stared at my mashed potatoes for several seconds before speaking again. "Your father used that bench every morning." Daniel sighed softly beside her. "Mom, nobody is trying to disrespect Dad. We are just making updates." Updates. Such harmless little words. Repaint. Remodel. Modernize. Update. Every sentence sounded polite enough to outsiders. But underneath them was the same message repeating over and over. "Richard is gone. Your time here is ending too." Later that night, I walked quietly upstairs while the house slept. The bedroom door stood partially open again. Inside, I found Vanessa's clothing already hanging in part of the closet beside my empty wooden hangers. Her perfume rested on the bathroom counter where my lavender lotion used to sit. I stood there silently in the darkness, one hand resting against the doorway while grief moved through me like cold water. Then my eyes drifted toward the framed family photograph still sitting on the dresser. Richard had his arm around my shoulders in that picture. Daniel stood beside us smiling at 21 years old before ambition and distance hardened something inside him. I picked up the photograph carefully and held it against my chest. They thought they were slowly removing me from the house. What they did not realize was that every selfish decision they made was quietly removing themselves from Richard's trust instead. The breaking point came on a quiet Sunday afternoon. Rain clouds hung low over the neighborhood while soft music drifted from the upstairs hallway. I had spent most of the morning organizing the boxes still stacked inside the downstairs guest room when I realized one was missing. First, I thought I had simply overlooked it. But after checking twice, I knew exactly which one had disappeared. Richard's memory box. The wooden box where we kept 42 years of our life together. Old anniversary cards. Photographs from Cape Cod vacations. Daniel's hospital bracelet from the day he was born. Letters Richard wrote me during business trips long before cell phones existed. My chest tightened instantly. I walked upstairs slowly, my heartbeat growing louder with every step. The bedroom door stood wide open. Inside, Vanessa knelt on the floor beside several trash bags while sorting through old belongings from the closet. For one terrible second I could not breathe. Richard's memory box sat open beside her. Tissue paper spilled across the carpet. Framed photographs rested carelessly in piles around her knees. "What are you doing?" I asked quietly. Vanessa glanced up with visible annoyance, as though I had interrupted something minor. "Relax," she said. "I was organizing." Organizing. I stared at the contents of the box scattered across the floor. One of Richard's handwritten anniversary cards bent backward beneath a stack of magazines. A photograph from our honeymoon partially crumpled near the trash bag. "You had no right to touch that," I whispered. Vanessa stood slowly, brushing dust from her hands. "Evelyn, half this stuff is honestly junk. You cannot keep holding on to every little thing forever." Junk. 42 years reduced to junk. I stepped toward the box carefully and picked up the anniversary card with trembling fingers. Richard wrote it 30 years earlier after our first real financial struggle, when we nearly lost the house during a recession. "No matter what happens," he had written, "this home will always belong to us." I swallowed hard while staring down at his handwriting. Behind me, Vanessa let out a small impatient sigh. "Daniel and I are trying to move forward," she said. "This house cannot stay frozen in the past." Frozen in the past. I turned slowly toward her then. For the first time since Richard's funeral, I allowed myself to truly look at my daughter-in-law without excuses softening the truth. There was no grief in her face. No compassion. Only irritation that I was still standing in the way of the life she thought was already hers. That evening after dinner, I quietly called Thomas Bennett from the downstairs bedroom. "I think it is time," I told him softly. There was a brief silence on the line before he answered. "I agree." Upstairs, I could hear Vanessa laughing while discussing wallpaper samples with a friend over speakerphone. Daniel laughed too. They sounded relaxed. Victorious even. Neither of them realized that every cruel little decision they made had already sealed their future. And for the first time in weeks I slept peacefully. Thomas arrived the following Thursday evening just after 6 o'clock carrying a slim black leather folder beneath one arm. Vanessa opened the front door with a bright polite smile that faded almost immediately when she recognized him. "Mr. Bennett," she said carefully. "I did not realize we were expecting company." Thomas removed his coat slowly, calm and composed as always. "Good evening, Vanessa." Daniel stepped into the foyer moments later, confusion already spreading across his face. "Thomas? What is this?" I stood quietly near the staircase with Richard's framed photograph resting against my chest. For the first time since the funeral, I no longer felt uncertain walking through my own home. Thomas glanced toward me briefly before speaking. "Your mother asked me to come discuss the Harper family trust." Silence settled across the house instantly. Vanessa folded her arms tightly. "Can this not wait?" Thomas met her eyes evenly. "No, it cannot." We moved into the dining room where the same mahogany table Richard bought 25 years earlier still sat beneath the chandelier Vanessa planned to replace. Rain tapped softly against the windows while Thomas opened his folder with deliberate care. Daniel shifted uncomfortably beside his wife. "Mom," he said quietly, "what is going on?" I looked at him calmly. "Your father wanted certain things made very clear." Thomas removed several documents and placed them neatly on the table. 7 months ago, Richard Harper amended his trust agreement to include behavioral protection clauses concerning his wife's residency and treatment inside the family home. Vanessa's expression tightened immediately. Daniel frowned. "What does that mean exactly?" Thomas adjusted his glasses before continuing. "It means the property remains solely under Evelyn Harper's lifetime control. It also means any attempt to pressure, manipulate, isolate, or remove her from the home results in immediate forfeiture of inheritance rights. The color drained slowly from Daniel's face. Vanessa leaned forward sharply. That is ridiculous. Nobody pressured her. Thomas calmly opened another section of the folder. Mrs. Harper documented multiple incidents following Richard's funeral, including relocation of her personal belongings without consent, unauthorized alterations to shared spaces, discussions regarding permanent reassignment of her bedroom, and disposal of sentimental property. Daniel looked toward me in stunned disbelief. You documented us? I held his gaze steadily for the first time in weeks. I listened. Thomas continued speaking in the same measured tone. Additionally, there are witness statements from contractors and movers confirming renovation discussions began before Richard Harper's burial. Vanessa's chair scraped lightly against the floor as she stood. This is insane, she snapped. We were trying to help her move forward. Thomas did not react. Intent becomes difficult to defend when inheritance conversations and property valuation estimates occur simultaneously. Daniel's face had gone pale now. Truly pale. He looked suddenly younger sitting there, frightened in the same way he used to look after breaking something important as a child. Mom, he said quietly, you cannot seriously be doing this. For several seconds I simply studied my son across the table. The little boy who once cried after scraping his knee on our driveway. The teenager Richard proudly taught to drive. The grown man who moved my life into boxes before the cemetery flowers had wilted. No, Daniel, I answered softly. Your father did this. Silence filled the room after that. Heavy and absolute. Upstairs, the floorboards creaked faintly beneath the unfinished renovations. Paint samples still covered the bedroom they thought would soon belong to them. Thomas closed the folder carefully before sliding one final document across the table toward Daniel. Effective immediately, he said calmly. All inheritance rights connected to the Harper residence have been revoked. Vanessa stared at the papers in complete shock while Daniel lowered his eyes toward the table, unable to speak. And sitting there beneath the warm dining room lights Richard once installed himself, I finally understood something clearly. Grief had not destroyed me. It had revealed everyone exactly as they truly were.